Hi, I'm Lisa Rubel from Love to Color My World, and I'm here with another Skill Builder video from Sit and Sew Fabrics, and today we're talking hexes. Are hexes something that's been on your bucket list and you just haven't been sure how to start? It can be intimidating to figure out how to sew those six-sided shapes together. It's not quite the same as squares, rectangles, and even triangles. Well, the Hexes Galore kit comes with the pieces all cut for you. If we open it up, and you'll see the secret weapon. These are half hexes. Instead of trying to join full hexes together, we'll be sewing vertical rows of half hexes, and then when the rows are joined together, it will look like we've got full hexes. Problem solved, easy piecing. Now this kit has 180 pre-cut half hexy shapes. That's 180 shapes that you don't have to cut. It's already done for you. In addition to all of the pre-cut half hexes, the kit also comes with fabric for both the binding and the backing. So all that you need to provide is batting and a little sewing know-how, which I'll help you out with. So the first step in making your hexie quilt is to lay out all of your half hexie pieces. If you look at the back side of the pattern, you can see there's a layout diagram that will show you how to put the pieces together in rows. And from there, it's up to you on the fabric placement. But you've got your first vertical row here, and then your second row that will complete hexes in that row based on putting two matching fabrics together. And then the third row, adding matching fabrics, will complete some more hexes. So you need to make sure that each half hexie has a matching pair to create that full hexie shape across the whole quilt. Obviously the exception to that will be the first row and the last row, where there will be some that don't have a pair, but every other one you want to make sure that two matching hexes go together to make that shape. Once you've got your layout set, you'll want to either take a picture of it that you can refer back to, or use some sort of numbering system. I personally put numbers on masking tape and then put one on each piece so I can keep track of the order, because half hexie placement in this quilt is key so that you end up with full hexes when everything is pieced together, so you don't want to get confused about which piece goes where. Once you've got that figured out, it's time to start piecing our vertical rows. We're going to take the first two hexes and lay them right sides together, and you can see what you don't want to do is to align them so that the tips line up on the fabrics. You want there to be a 1/4 inch of overlap on each end. So if you look here, you can see I've got the 1/4 inch there and the 1/4 inch there. And then we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam right down that edge. And you'll kind of be able to check if you're at the 1/4 inch, because your needle should hit right where those two fabrics join on the front end, and then right where they join at the back end. So you're going to stitch a 1/4 inch there, and our first two hexes will be pieced. So once those are pieced, we're going to trim off these little tails. So grab a ruler, trim off the triangle on one side, flip it over, and trim off the opposite triangle. And then we'll press that piece open. In the first row, you want to press the seams going towards the top. And then in the second row, we will press them going to the bottom so that our seams nest when we join the rows. So here's what our first two pieces look like. What I would do if I were making this quilt is to chain piece and sew my half hexes together in pairs and get a whole row done like that, and then continue joining the pairs until I have one full vertical row done, and then move on to the next. If you're nervous about fabric placement, you can always sew them one piece at a time. So if I were to do that, then this would be my next piece. I would line it up just like we talked about with the first one, with a 1/4 inch of overlap on both ends, and then stitch on this 1/4 inch seam again. And then we'll trim off those little tips again. And you're going to continue adding hexes in that first row till you have all 15 joined together. And then continue on with the remaining rows as well. Going to continue pressing towards the top in my first vertical row. So there we go, I've got it started, and I'll keep going on the first row. So as you finish piecing each vertical row, your best choice is to put it back on your design wall or design carpet or whatever you might be using so that you can keep track of all the rows being in the right order. And after all of your vertical rows are pieced, it's time to start sewing those rows together. Now I've got two shorter sections I'm working with just because it's easier to do a demo with these shorter pieces. You of course will be working with a row of hexes that is 15 long. So take your first two rows, and what we're going to do is first of all double check that the way they're set up you have hexes, every other hexe should be making a full matching color hexe. Just to triple check, double check, make sure that your rows are in the right order. So once you've confirmed that, you're going to flip them right sides together. And this is where our pressing matters, because since we press the odd rows up and the even rows down, when we go to pin them together, our seam allowances will nest because they're going in opposite directions. So get those first two seam allowances to nest and put a pin in. I'm going to pin at the end as well. And then work your way down the row, pinning at each seam allowance. While I'm doing this, I'll talk a little bit about pinning in general. A lot of times people ask about should they be pinning as they're joining the half hexes together. Absolutely. If pinning makes you more comfortable, definitely do that. I tend to not pin for shorter pieces, but these pieces are cut on the bias, so there is some stretch. So to do the most accurate piecing, pins will help make sure that your fabric doesn't stretch out as you're joining the individual pieces into a row. And then of course you'll need to pin here for joining the rows together. Now if you look, you'll notice that I actually pin after where the seams meet, and that's just a personal preference of mine, because when I pin before, I'm pulling the pin out before the needle actually gets there. And by having my pin after the seam, my pin will stay in place, and therefore my fabrics will stay tightly together where I want them to until the needle gets all the way up to that seam. So again, that's just how I like to do it, but it's a nice little tip I like to share. So once you have your first two vertical rows pinned together, then we're going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance the whole way down, taking out the pins as you go, of course. So I've got my first two rows of my mini sample section sewn together. Again, yours will be much longer. I'm going to bring it over to my ironing board, and for these vertical seams we're going to press the seam open, and that will help to minimize the bulk at those joins and give you a nice flat quilt when you're finished putting it all together. So after I press on the back, then I like to turn it to the front and just give it a little touch up there. And you can see I've got my two full hexagons here, and because of those nested seams, my points line up pretty nicely. So you're going to do the same thing for the rest of your rows. My recommendation would be to continue sewing them together in pairs. And so you'll end up with 6 pairs of vertical rows, and then start joining those pairs up until you finish the whole quilt top. Just makes it a little easier to work with skinnier rows rather than the growing quilt. And with your last vertical seam, you'll sew the 2 halves together and your quilt top will be ready for trimming. So once you have all your rows joined together, you'll have a quilt that looks like this, but much larger. I just did a little sample version so that I could show you how to do the different pieces of this quilt. Yours will be much bigger. And what we're going to do now is trim off the points of these hexagons so we have a nice straight edge for adding the binding. So what you want to do is get your quilt spread out on a flat surface. Start in one corner. Take your ruler and position it so that the straight edge of the ruler aligns with the gaps between the hexagons. And then what I like to do to just check on how straight I am is to compare the seams between my rows with the straight edge horizontal lines on my ruler, and try to find a way that keeps the edge straight with the gaps in the hexagons and also stays with those seam lines. So once you've found that, you can trim, get all those little hexy pieces off, and then as you go to trim the rest of it, what you want to do is slide your quilt up and keep the ruler aligned with part of your cut edge as you go to cut more of the quilt, and that will just be another safeguard to make sure that you're trimming the edge of your quilt straight. And that way, when you have both sides, both the top and the bottom of your quilt trimmed, your entire quilt will have a nice squared off shape and you won't have any angles to it. So once you've finished trimming your quilt, then you'll make a quilt sandwich with your backing, your batting, your quilt top. Quilt your hexagon quilt however you'd like, and use the enclosed fabric to make binding and bind your quilt, and then you can start enjoying your hexi quilt.